hotbed. Jerusalem was too likely to break out into riots at any point, so they move him to Caesarea and say, we'll deal with him there. When he gets there, the governor of the province is a man named Felix, and so he's there with Felix, and Felix doesn't feel like Paul has necessarily done anything wrong, anything against Roman law. He may have some dispute with the Jewish leaders, but that's really got nothing to do with us. But he's like, I don't really know what to do with this man, so I'll just keep him here. So for 2 years, Paul stays there under Felix. Then a new governor comes into power. His name is Festus. And so now Paul is being tried by Festus. And every once in a while, Festus will bring him out and ask Paul to make a defense of his faith there. And so Paul will again speak about his faith in Jesus and why he's here and why the Jewish people are against him and that kind of stuff. Then another man comes, a man called Agrippa comes to Caesarea, a king of another nation, and they trot Paul out again to talk to Agrippa and make another defense of his faith. At that point, they're about ready to let him go, but Paul says, I've had enough of this, I appeal to Caesar. Paul is a Roman citizen, and so he has the right to appeal to Caesar to hear his case. And they say, well, if he's appealed to Caesar, then he has to go to Caesar, so they send him to Rome. So he gets on a boat from Caesarea, and he heads out to Rome. They get into some trouble while they're sailing. A big storm comes up and breaks up the ship, and they're shipwrecked on an island called Malta. And so they are sort of shipwrecked there for 3 months. It is one of the most exciting passages in Scripture. When I was young, probably grade 6, grade 7, my first adult Bible class that I went to was my dad speaking from the book of Acts. I kind of aged out of the youth group that we had other kids for, so I went to the adult class. And he was teaching through the book of Acts, and I'd never read this before. And I came to him, I was reading ahead of class, and I came to him and said, Dad, this is so exciting. It's like watching a movie, the way it's described. The shipwreck and the attempts that they make to survive this shipwreck, and being stuck on the island for 3 months and what happens to them there. So chapters 26, 27 or so of Acts, go read it when you have the time. Not just because it's exciting, of course it tells us important things about the God that we serve, but it is also just a well-told story and fun to read. After being shipwrecked in Malta for about 3 months, they find another ship that is able to leave that area and take them on to Rome. Will take them to Italy, and from there they travel up to Rome. And finally Paul gets to Rome as he's been wanting to. He's under house arrest at this point. He is still technically under arrest, even though he got shipwrecked and left on a desert island for 3 months. He's still under arrest, and so they bring him there, and they let him live by himself, but he's not allowed to leave the house. He's under house arrest. And so we'll finish up the book next week by talking about what happens to Paul while he's under house arrest. Right now we're covering that whole span of time. I think what's important from these chapters, kind of the theme that holds them together, is the relationship that the early church has with the governing authorities, with the power structures that are in place. The municipal power structures, the provincial power structures, and finally the whole Roman Empire. Because the church is a fast-growing movement, and they do come to the attention of the Roman rulers. And there's some conversation about what's going to be done with these so-called Christians and the effect that they're having on their populations and on the cities that they're a part of. So they are, we've talked about this a number of times in the book of Acts already, that how they come to the attention of the Roman rulers, but now it's much more the case. And so I think it's important for us to talk about. This is not the only place that this topic is discussed in Scripture. Maybe you think of Paul in Romans 13, as he's writing a letter to the Romans, talking about the relationship of the church to the government, and he says you all must submit to the governing authorities. He says they've been put in place by God to do a specific role, and that role is to punish the guilty, to punish evildoers. So if you don't do the wrong thing, then you've got nothing to fear from the rulers. So it's a very positive view of the government, of the power structures of the day that Paul has. They've been put there by God to do one particular job, and that job is just to punish evildoers, to punish those who transgress against the law. And so you should submit to them, and they won't harm you at all. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the book of Revelation that talks about the government as if they are literally evil incarnate. The government rulers are the horns on the head of the beast. So the beast that has been plaguing humanity for all of humanity's lifetime. The horns that grow out of the head of this beast are your local and provincial and municipal governments. So that's not a great place to start. But also we learn that governments are violent, and they're manipulative, and they're out of control, and they are, at their heart, evil. So we have Paul saying that the government has been put there by God to punish evildoers, and you submit to them. And we have John saying, no, governments are evil incarnate, and they are violent and manipulative, and should be resisted in any way possible. What is Acts going to tell us about how we should view the government based on how Paul is treated in these days? Let's look at that. Very early on in Acts chapter 22, Paul is brought to the Romans because of this riot. Or sorry, the Romans come in and grab Paul because of the riot, and they want to figure out what's going on. They know that Paul is kind of a central character in this riot, and so the commander of the Roman legion says, we'll take Paul away into the courtyard and have him flogged, have him whipped, so that he'll be in the right sort of mood to answer questions, and then we'll figure out what's at the bottom of this. So think about what's happening here. The city is in a riot because of this man. And so to figure out what's happening, we want to take the person who is being persecuted by the crowd and torture him in order that we can ask him questions about why these people want him killed. I would think that if you have a group of people, a city of people, wanting to kill one man, that you should maybe talk to the people in that mob, quiet them down a little bit, have them flogged if you need to for destroying the city, and then ask your questions and figure out why they want to kill the man. But instead, they're taking the persecuting man and saying, well, let's have him flogged, and then he'll be in the right sort of mood to answer some questions for us, and we'll be able to take care of this. So this is our introduction to the Roman government in the book of Acts. We've seen them before, but this is, in this primary story about the government's possession of Paul, this is how we're introduced to them. That the military is going to grab Paul and have him flogged for the crime of being the victim of a mob riot. Paul convinces them not to do that because Paul is a Roman citizen. And Paul says, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been put on trial? And the Roman centurion knows that that very much is not legal, and so he says, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're in, by the way, chapter 23 of Acts. I'm not going to do a lot of reading. I'm just going to kind of tell the story here, and you can follow along with me. Paul convinces them not to flog him because he's a Roman citizen. He says it's not legal for you to do this, and they agree that it's not legal, so that doesn't happen. So the commander says, well, this is what we'll do instead. We'll call together the leaders of the city, and we'll call Paul in as well, and we'll have a sit-down chat with everybody, and we'll figure out what's going on. Now pay attention to what's happening there. The Roman centurion knows that it's a possibility that we could invite in the leaders of the city and Paul, and we could just all sit down in a room together and talk this out and decide what it is we're going to do. The Roman centurion knows that that's a possibility, and yet his first instinct is to have Paul tortured. This is how we're introduced to the Romans, as people who don't care about the life or the rights of one man, who don't think of him as being an important character in his own story, who just think he's an obstacle. He's a problem for us right now. We're trying to keep the peace in the city, and this man Paul is causing us problems. We don't know what it's about. We don't know what he's done wrong. We don't know if he's done anything wrong. While we try and figure that out, let's just have him tortured to see if that leads us anywhere. Even though he knows he could just call in the leaders of the city and have a sit-down chat and figure this whole thing out. This is how we're introduced to the Roman government. And it is not a positive start for them. I think the idea that we would see citizens this way as being disposable parts of some problem, just an obstacle to us keeping the peace, kind of verifies what we read in other places in human history about how governments view their citizens or non-citizens. Paul is in a special trouble here because they don't think of him as being a citizen because he's a Jew. But he says, no, actually I was born a citizen. And so because he's a citizen, he has more rights under the government system. But this is how we're introduced to them, that they think of him as a non-citizen and is therefore not an important person, not a real person, not somebody with rights, not somebody that we have to respect, not somebody that we have to listen to, just an obstacle to us keeping the peace. Because he's not a citizen, we don't have to worry about what he wants, what's best for him. We can just do whatever we want in order to keep our function as a government, which is just to maintain the peace in this city. We're going to clamp down on anything associated with this whole riot and just figure it out later. We'll take care of the mess later. We just want to quiet everybody down, and so we'll start by torturing Paul. That's how we get to know the Roman government first. Next, Paul, after they've sorted that out and had their sit-down talk, and the Roman centurion realizes that Paul can't be kept there because it's going to be too much damage to the city. He has him shipped to Caesarea, where he's imprisoned by Felix. I always get Felix and Festus mixed up. I can't remember which one comes first. This morning I realized they're in alphabetical order. So every time I stumble over their names, that's me saying, does L come before S? Yes, it does. Felix. So he's imprisoned there with Felix. And for 2 years, Felix keeps him there in prison. He doesn't really think Paul has done anything wrong. He certainly hasn't done anything against Roman law. Maybe he's done something against Jewish law, but Felix doesn't care about that. But for 2 years, he just keeps him in prison there because he can. We're told that early in chapter 24, Felix does this partially because he's hoping for a bride. And of course that's what it was, right? Of course that's what it was. It doesn't take us long to get to the real heart of what's going on here. Felix isn't trying to do what's best for his citizens, for his jurisdiction, for his constituents. He's not trying to keep the peace. He's not trying to solve any problems. He's trying to line his own pocketbook. He's trying to get himself a second house in the country or a nicer yacht or whatever it is. He just wants money to spend on himself. And $10,000 here, $10,000 there, it really begins to add up after a while, you know. So he's just hoping for a bribe from Paul. And I think if we have done any reading in history, whether it's the ancient history or whether it's the last 10 years or the last 50 years or the last 200 years of knowing about our government, we know that this kind of corruption is prevalent. That this kind of thing goes on all the time. That people are always looking for a way to make their lives a little bit better at the expense of justice, and at the expense of doing the right thing, at the expense of helping your people, the people that you're supposed to be governing. Of course it was a bribe. It was always going to be a bribe. Although the very next verse, this is 24, verse 26 and 27, the new guy comes in. Felix serves out his term, and now Festus has come to be governor of the province. And so he is introduced to Paul and says, this man has been living as a prisoner in your barracks for the last 2 years. He hasn't really done anything wrong. Well, the Jews kind of think he's done something wrong, but he hasn't broken any Roman laws, but we keep him here. And Felix says, or Festus says, okay, I think I understand the situation. And he continues to keep Paul imprisoned because he's doing it as a favor for the Jews. And we read that and we say, oh, of course that's what it is. Of course it's not justice. Of course it's not the idea of governing properly. It's the idea of trading favors with people. Some people are just in it for the money, the people who look for positions of power, but some are in it for the control, for the influence, for the favors. Right? If I'm governor of a province, there are laws that I can make or not make. There are investigations that I can undertake or not undertake. There are rules that I can follow or not follow that will help out various of my constituents. And the choices that I make influence them and how their lives are running. And so I can choose to ignore certain things. I can choose to overlook certain behaviors. I can choose to look past certain events from their history. And I do that, they're happy with me. If I do that, they vote me in for another term. If I do that, they convince their fellow people in the city to look favorably upon me and to treat me well and to make sure things run smoothly. It's all a matter of influence. It's all a matter of doing favors. It's all a matter of networking. And so in these power structures, we get, again, people who are looking for this kind of influence on the world around them so that they can turn things in their favor always. And of course, if the government is looking for favors from people, who are they looking to? The rich, the powerful, those who are already embedded in the system and have a voice. And who are they ignoring? The poor, the oppressed, the minorities, the non-citizens. These are the people who don't matter because they can't give me anything. And so the very people that have already been silenced just by the circumstances of their life are further silenced by the fact that governors have no use for them. The people who are in power look at a poor, oppressed person, a minority, and say, well, this person can't give me anything, so there's really no motivation for me to do anything for them. And of course, if it wasn't going to be bribery, it was going to be looking for favors, and looking to see what favors you can do for somebody else, so you can call that favor back in later. Of course, that's always what it was going to be. I'm taking the title for this sermon, When I Find It Convenient, from chapter 24, verse 25. This is Felix speaking to Paul. Remember, he's kept him there for 2 years. And every once in a while, he'll bring him out because he likes to listen to Paul talk. Paul has a lot to say, as you know. And Paul talks about justice, and Paul talks about obedience, and Paul talks about our life here in relationship to God, or the gods, as Felix would think of it. And Felix kind of likes to hear him talk on occasion. And so, as well as looking for a bribe, he's just also keeping Paul around because he likes him as entertainment value, I guess. And he will call Paul out, and then when he's had enough of him, he'll send him back away. And he says, I'll call for you again when it's convenient for me. And that really is at the heart of what's going on here. In all these 6, 7 chapters of the book of Acts, what we see again and again and again is the people who are in charge being inconvenienced by Paul and doing everything that they can to silence him or use him at their convenience. When it's convenient for me, the governor says, I can give you a bit of a break. But really, I'm just looking out for me. And again, if you have had any run-ins with our government in the last week or 10 years or 50 years, you've probably seen this behavior played out on more than one occasion. Where the people who are supposed to be serving us, the people who are supposed to be working society for our benefit, the people who are supposed to be taking care of their constituents, the people that have elected them, are really only doing what's convenient for them. I imagine not many of you have been sent away to be flogged. You don't see that thing happen very much anymore. And it's probable that not many of you have been outright asked for a bribe. Because fortunately, I think, we don't see that very much anymore. But this underlining idea of when it's convenient for me, I think is something we encounter a lot in our government. That the people who are attracted to these positions of power, the people who fight their way to the top of these power structures, are doing so because it's beneficial to them. And their idea is to arrange society in ways that benefit them the most. And our relationship with the government as the church, I think, should be to keep that fact in mind. This leads into a couple of quotes that I wanted to read from a man named David Lipscomb. He's somebody that we have mentioned a couple of times in the Bible class that we've been having for the last several weeks, because he's a member of the Churches of Christ. He's influential in the Churches of Christ. There's, in fact, a school in Tennessee named after him right now, Church of Christ School, David Lipscomb University. And so we talked about him a couple of times, briefly mentioned him. And he's somebody that stands apart in the history of our movement because of his very particular view on the government. And it's one I admit that resonates with me. Here is David Lipscomb with the book he wrote on civil government. It actually began as a series of newspaper articles. You remember, again, if you were in class, one thing that comes out of the Restoration movement is these periodicals, these magazines, newspapers that are published that are instrumental in sort of setting the tone for the early Churches of Christ. He writes a series of journal articles about government and then collects them into this book. David Lipscomb was born in 1831, so he was 30 when the Civil War started. And he looked at the ravages of the Civil War, the horrors of the Civil War, and he said, this is no good whatsoever. And as being somebody who was very hopeful for democracy early in his life, he became somebody that was embittered about the possibilities of government and what government could do for the world, because he just looked at the Civil War around him and said, look, these people dying, most of them aren't interested in the battle that's being fought here. It's just governments fighting against each other. It's people in positions of power thinking that they have important jobs to do and making this happen. And so he writes sort of out of that perspective, and I wanted to read a couple of things that he says. I know, it's going to be difficult, I'm sorry. But
it's me.
Yes, that's definitely the first one. Every human government uses the substance, the time, the service of their subjects to enrich, gratify the appetites and lusts, and to promote the grandeur and glory of the rulers. People were awful fancy back then. What he's saying is, every government takes from its subjects their time and their resources and their very substance. And what does the government do with that time and resource and substance that they've stolen from their subjects? They just use it to gratify their own desires. They use it to elevate their own grandeur. They use it to make themselves into something special. Just taking and taking and taking and just using that for their own good. Put it more simply, the rulers of the human oppress the subjects for their own benefit. So that's what he says in another time. Our rulers are always just taking and taking and taking, and they do it just to oppress us for their own benefit. Some people might say, well, that would be true perhaps if we don't do a good job of picking our rulers, but we're a democracy and we have the right to pick our own rulers, and we need to pick people who are best suited to actually lead us. And to that he says, it is not true that in democratic or in any other kind of government, the people themselves are rulers. They choose the rulers at the mitigation of a few interested leaders. Then those rulers rule for their own selfish good and glory, as when rulers do. I think I must have made some mistakes in typing that, because that didn't make a lot of sense. But what he was saying is, we don't even really freely pick our own rulers, because it's only a very few rich people that are able to run for office, and then they use the powers of their wealth and the powers of their influence and the rich friends that they have to corrupt our choices. So we think we're being led down one path and we're really being led down another path completely. And he says, again, there is no truly democratic government. If we could all pick whoever we wanted to run for us and to rule us, perhaps we might pick somebody who would look out for our interests. But our choices are so restricted by the power structure that is already in place, and by the system and network of influence and of money that's already in place, that we don't really have free choice. We can pick this guy who's not good for us or this guy who's not good for us. And it's only when they get into office that we realize how not good for us they are. And so this illusion of choice is just an illusion. And you can't make anything better by saying that. He also says, the picture here drawn is not that of the worst and most despotic forms of government among the ignorant and degraded, but as it would and did exist among the Jewish people, with the best rulers that could be found. So he says, perhaps you would say, well, yes, in a lot of populations, that might be the kind of government you get, but that's just the worst examples. You can pick from better examples. And he says, well, how about we go to the Jewish people? People who are part of the covenant of Abraham. People who live by the law of Moses. People who have as their example King David. We go to them, people who have been molded by the prophets and have been shaped by God himself and chosen to be his examples of justice and mercy in the world. We go to them and we say, what kind of rulers did they get? And we see that they also, for the most part, got only people who were interested in their own wealth and in their own well-being. Rulers who led the people astray and led them away from God on more than one occasion. He says, you can't say, well, it's only because we're choosing from the worst of the people. If we choose from even the best of the people, people who've been chosen by God himself, we still end up with rulers who aren't looking out for the best interests of their people. And finally, it is not in man to have government in which the selfish element will not prevail, and which will not be used to tax and oppress the ruled for the glory and aggrandizement of the rulers. It's just not in us, he says. We can't do it because we're unable to do it. And it's not about getting a new system of government that will finally allow us to have the just and fair rulers that we want. It's not about enacting new legislation that will change the process by which we vote or how we finance the campaigns or the restrictions we place upon people when they get into government. It's just not in us to get this right. Because God has chosen the government we should have. And that is the government where he is our king. Jesus rules over the earth for him. And any government that isn't that government is necessarily going to fail us. All right. That, I'll remind you, quotes from David Lipscomb, not quotes from the Bible. So you don't have to agree with it. If I read from the Bible, I expect you to say, yes, I think that's true, Richard. But if I read from David Lipscomb, you don't have to. It sounds right to me, though. I think he's on to something there. And if I read the book of Acts, I see plenty of examples of rulers living exactly like David Lipscomb warns us. People who are only in it for themselves, people who are looking for bribes, people who are looking to swap favors with powerful people, people who think, well, we'll just torture this guy while things settle down and then we'll figure out the answer from there. People who say, I will call you when it's convenient for me, because my convenience is what sets my agenda, not what's good for you or what's good for my people at large. That's the government I see in the book of Acts, and I don't think it's any accident that Luke lays it out that way. When we get to the end of this little episode in Paul's life where he's been taken to Rome, I mentioned that he gets shipwrecked on an island. Exciting, exciting stuff. The storm comes up, and the sailors don't know what to do, and they're throwing stuff overboard to lighten the ship. And I think about that storm. I think about how uncontrollable it is. I think about what a disaster it represents for the people. I think about what a metaphor it is for the government that has Paul in its grip. Paul is just carried along by the government, like carried along by the winds and the waves. Paul is unable to steer the storm as he's unable to steer the government towards justice. Paul is dashed up on the rocks by the storm, just as he is dashed up on the rocks of cruelty and inhumane treatment by the government that sees him as just a plaything. I don't want to press the metaphor too hard. You're smart enough, you get it. The storm is like the government. There is one major difference between the two, though. People don't try and make friends with the storm. People look at the storm and they say, oh, that's a destructive, uncontrollable power that I cannot be friends with, that I cannot make nice with, that I cannot pretend is going to make my life better. But even as a church sometimes, we will look at our government and say, they're on our side. We can play nice with these people. We can be friends with them. I don't know that that's what Scripture tells us, or where Scripture is leading us. I think there's something about power that inherently draws a certain kind of people to it. Or maybe it's that power, when people get in that role, are corrupted by it, as the famous phrase goes, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Whether it's because it only attracts a certain kind of evil person, or whether it's because it makes evil people out of good people, there's something about being at the top of these power structures that squeezes light out of people and lets the darkness in. I think, as a church, we need to be very careful about who we offer our hands of friendship to. I think we need to be very careful about saying, this person will get us to where we want to go. Because God hasn't chosen governments to deliver his message. He's chosen the church. God hasn't chosen governments to call people to him. He's chosen his church. God hasn't chosen governments to be light and salt in the world. He's chosen his church. And I'm not here to take a stand against any particular form of the government, any particular ruler, any particular person in office at the moment or in years past or in years to come. I don't particularly want to wade into those waters. But I think we do ourselves a disservice when we get caught up in power structures that the world thinks are a good idea. That the world is designed to work a certain way. I think we do a disservice to God, who has called us to be a people apart, a people of his kingdom, a people citizens of heaven before they're citizens of any nation or structure in this world. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we forget that we have already found an absolute power, and that we've committed ourselves to it before anything else, committed ourselves to him before anything else. I don't think we want to make friends with the storm. I don't think we want to end up shipwrecked in these particular waters, because they are deep and there are beasts down there. I think if we have set our hearts on Jesus and set our eyes on the Father, and have resolved to walk by the Spirit, that we have already done what we can to make this world a place of justice and of peace. And I think that when we are being led by our eyes and led by our hearts and walking by the Spirit, we are influencing this world in ways that we can't even begin to understand. And when we go to the election box, that's not the word for it, not election box, ballot box. So we go to the ballot box during an election and cast our vote. It's very easy to see what the differences might be. The candidates are on television all the time talking about what it is that they want to do for the world. And you can just look up their website and it will tell you, I want to do this and this and this and this and this. And we can say, I think those would be good things. And I can see how voting for this person would get those things made as policy, and I can see how the world would be better. It's so easy to see, so difficult to see how we make a difference in the world just by being followers of the way. But even one of those ways is easier to see than the other. I think it might be the more difficult one that is ultimately the most influential. think it might be the most difficult one, just simply existing in this world as Christians that will, in the end, have the greatest influence on the world around us. I don't know how much of what I'm saying this morning is God's truth. I don't like to deviate from God's truth. I like to say, Romans 5:6 says this is true. I feel a little bit shaky this morning. Because while Scripture certainly leads us, I think, in the last half of Acts in particular, leads us in the direction that I'm saying, it's not the only thing that Scripture has to say about government. I talked already about Paul saying submit. But I'll ask you to listen to your hearts, I guess, and listen to wisdom. And pay attention to what you read in the newspapers and what you've heard from your history teachers. I'll just ask you to consider if we should be making friends with this storm, or whether we're doing more damage to the world around us and to the boat that we are on by trying to do this. I will say, fix your eyes on Jesus, point your heart towards God, walk by the Spirit, and we know that that is true. Be careful of the storm, because who knows what's in there.